The ground trembled before the sound reached him. Silas Veylan reined in his dust-scarred Mustang, eyes narrowing toward the horizon where a thin wall of ochre haze rolled closer. With unnatural speed. It wasn't a storm. It was the Iron Fang riders, mercenaries on steel-shod horses, hired not to rob or kill, but to erase every trace of the new railroad line cutting through the valley. And Silas, the last surveyor still standing, was the only thing between them and the map that could change the West forever. The air was dry enough to crack skin, the kind of heat that made sweat feel like it evaporated before it formed. Silas could taste the grit in his teeth, hear the faint metallic jingle of tack and weaponry carried on the wind. His fingers brushed the rolled parchment strapped to his saddle-inked lines and measurements that represented months of work and the future of a dozen towns. If the riders got it, the railroad would vanish from the valley's future like it had never been planned. He nudged the Mustang toward a cluster of basalt outcrops, the only cover for half a mile. The horse's breathing was steady, but its ears flicked nervously at the approaching thunder of hooves. Silas's mind was already mapping the terrain angles, distances, the way the sun would blind a man riding in from the east. A rifle crack split the air. A puff of dust leapt from the rock inches from his head. They'd spotted him. Silas slid from the saddle in one smooth motion, landing in a crouch. He slapped the horse's flank, sending it bolting toward the far ridge. The parchment stayed with him. He wasn't about to let the Mustang take the risk. The riders came into view, 7 of them. Black dusters flaring, faces hidden behind red-striped scarves. Their leader, Garrick Thorne, rode at the center. Even at a distance, Silas could see the man's pale eyes, cold as river ice. Thorne wasn't just a hired gun. He was a tactician, the kind who could read a battlefield like a gambler reads a deck. Veylan. Thorne's voice carried over the plain. Hand over the map, and maybe I'll let you keep your legs. Silas's reply was a single shot from his Winchester, the bullet sparking off the iron stirrup of the man to Thorne's right. The riders swore and pulled back, but the formation didn't break. They were disciplined. That made them dangerous. The basalt outcrop gave Silas a moment's cover, but not much. He could feel the vibration of hooves through the stone. He counted the seconds between shots, the way the echoes bounced trying to pinpoint their positions. Every detail mattered. Another shot rang out, this one grazing his shoulder. The burn was sharp, but shallow. He gritted his teeth, shifted his weight, and fired twice in quick succession. One rider toppled sideways, his boot catching in the stirrup before he hit the ground. The others fanned out, tightening the noose. Silas's breathing slowed. He'd been in tighter spots before, but never with something this valuable at stake. The map wasn't just ink on paper, it was the promise of connection, of trade, of survival for towns that would otherwise wither in the dust. He thought of the faces in those towns, the way they'd looked at him when he'd ridden in with news of the railroad. Hope was a fragile thing out here, and he wasn't about to let Thorne crush it. The riders closed in. Silas ducked behind the rock, reloaded, and scanned the ground. 10 yards away, a narrow gully cut through the plain, hidden by scrub. If he could reach it, he could draw them into a choke point. He bolted. Bullets kicked up dirt around his boots, the air alive with the hiss and snap of lead. He dove into the gully, rolling to his feet in the shadow of its walls. The riders followed, their horses skidding on loose gravel as they funneled in after him. Silas waited until the first 2 were almost on him, then fired point blank. The confined space turned the gunshots into thunderclaps. One rider fell. The other's horse reared, throwing him into the rock wall. The rest tried to push through, but the gully's narrowness worked against them. Thorne's voice cut through the chaos. Hold, spread out. They began to back out, but Silas wasn't done. He scrambled up the gully wall, boots finding purchase in the crumbling stone, and emerged onto the plain above. From here, he had the high ground. He could see the riders below, their formation broken, their advantage gone. He took aim at Thorne. The man looked up, eyes locking with his. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Thorne smiled, a thin, dangerous curve of the lips, and wheeled his horse away. The riders followed, retreating into the haze they'd come from. Silas lowered his rifle, chest heaving. The map was still strapped to his back, the parchment warm against his skin. He knew this wasn't over. Thorne would be back, and next time, he wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating him. But for now, the valley was safe, and Silas Veylan was still standing. The sun had dipped low enough to turn the canyon walls into molten copper. Silas Veylan guided his Mustang along a narrow ledge, the map still strapped tight across his back. Every hoofstep echoed off the stone, a reminder that sound traveled far in these parts, and that somewhere behind him, Thorne's men were listening. He'd hoped the riders would retreat for good after their failed ambush in the gully. But men like Garrick Thorne didn't retreat. They recalculated. Silas knew the pause was nothing more than a predator's circle, the kind that tightened with every pass. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. Silas reined in, scanning the canyon floor below. A thin column of smoke curled upward from a cluster of cottonwoods, too controlled to be a wildfire, too careless to be a rancher's cookfire. His gut told him it was bait. He dismounted, leading the Mustang along the ledge until he found a narrow chute of rock that would take him down unseen. The descent was slow, his boots scraping against stone, the air cooling as shadows deepened. By the time he reached the canyon floor, the light had gone from gold to bruised purple. The camp was quiet, too quiet. A single pot hung over the fire, steam curling from its rim. No voices, no movement. Silas crouched low, his rifle ready, and edged closer. That's when he saw it. A strip of red striped cloth tied to a branch above the fire. The same pattern the riders wore over their faces. A calling card. The crack of a rifle split the stillness. The bullet punched into the dirt inches from his knee. Silas rolled behind a boulder, heart hammering. Shadows detached themselves from the canyon walls. For riders, rifles leveled, moving in a slow arc to box him in. "Drop the gun, Veylan." One of them barked. Silas didn't answer. Instead, he scanned the terrain. The firelight threw long, jagged shadows across the ground and beyond the cottonwoods. The canyon narrowed into a choke point. If he could get them to follow him there, the numbers wouldn't matter. He fired once, not to hit, but to make them flinch. Then he bolted, weaving between rocks. The Mustang's reins looped around his wrist as the horse galloped alongside. Bullets hissed past, one grazing the brim of his hat. The canyon walls closed in, the air thick with dust and the metallic tang of gunpowder. Silas ducked into a side crevice just wide enough for him and the horse. The riders thundered past, chasing the sound of his boots on stone. When the last of them passed, Silas stepped out, rifle raised. He fired into the canyon wall above them. The shot shattered a loose shelf of rock, sending a cascade of boulders crashing down. The sound was deafening, the dust choking. Two of the riders were thrown from their saddles. The others wheeled their horses in panic. Through the haze, Silas saw Thorne himself at the far end of the canyon, watching. The man didn't move to help his men. He just sat his horse, pale eyes locked on Silas, and gave the smallest nod, a promise, not of respect, but of inevitability. Then he turned and rode away. Silas stood in the settling dust, chest heaving. The map was still safe, but the message was clear. Thorne wasn't done. And next time, he wouldn't come with 7 men. He'd bring an army. The wind carried the smell of rain, but the sky was a hard, unbroken slate. Silas Veylan rode into Black Hollow just as the first lanterns were being lit. The town was little more than a scattering of weather-beaten buildings clinging to the edge of a dry gulch, a saloon, a livery, a shuttered general store, and the skeletal remains of an old silver mine. It had been abandoned for years, but tonight it would be his fortress. He dismounted in front of the saloon, boots crunching on the grit-strewn street. The Mustang's flanks were lathered with sweat, its breath coming in sharp bursts. Silas patted its neck, then led it into the livery's shadow. He'd need the horse fresh if he was going to get out alive. From the ridge above town, he could see the dust plume of riders approaching, slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring the hunt. Thorne was coming, and this time, he wasn't hiding behind the haze. There were more of them now, twice as many as before. Silas moved quickly. He checked the saloon's windows, barricading them with overturned tables. He scattered broken glass across the main street, knowing the riders' horses would shy from it. In the mine's entrance, he rigged a crude tripwire to a crate of blasting powder he'd found in the storehouse, a gamble. but one that might buy him precious seconds. By the time the first rider crested the ridge, the town was silent. The only sound was the faint creak of the saloon's swinging doors in the wind. "Veylan." Thorn's voice rolled down into the gulch, cold and certain. "You've run out of places to hide." Silas stepped into the street, rifle in hand. "Not hiding," he said. "Just waiting." The riders fanned out, their silhouettes black against the dying light. Thorn dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud. His pale eyes never left Silas. "You could have sold that map," Thorn said. "Made yourself rich. Instead, you're going to die for it." Silas's grip tightened on the Winchester. "Some things are worth more than gold." The first shot came from the left flank, a muzzle flash in the gloom. Silas dove behind a water trough, the bullet splintering the wood. He returned fire, dropping the shooter before he could chamber another round. The street erupted into chaos. Gunfire cracked from every direction, bullets whining off walls and ricocheting into the night. Silas moved between cover, his mind a map of angles and distances. He picked his shots carefully, each one finding its mark. A sudden roar shook the ground, the mine entrance exploding in a bloom of fire and rock. 2 riders were thrown clear, their horses bolting in panic. The tripwire had done its job, but Thorn kept coming. Through the smoke, Silas saw him advancing, revolver steady, eyes locked on his. They were 20 paces apart when the rain finally came, a sudden, hard curtain that turned the dust to mud and blurred the edges of the world. Thorn raised his gun. Silas fired first. The shot hit home, spinning Thorn sideways. He staggered, dropped to one knee, then fell face first into the mud. The remaining riders froze, their leader down. One by one, they turned their horses and rode into the storm. Silas stood in the rain, chest heaving, the map still strapped to his back. Black Hollow was silent again, save for the steady drum of water on the rooftops. He knew the fight for the railroad wasn't over. There would be others who wanted what he carried. But tonight, he'd won. And in the West, sometimes one night was all you could ask for. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving Black Hollow wrapped in a damp, uneasy silence. Silas Veylan stood in the saloon doorway, watching steam rise from the muddy street. The map was still strapped to his back, but it felt heavier now, not from the weight of the parchment, but from the knowledge that Garrick Thorn's death wouldn't end this. Men like Thorn didn't work alone. Someone had paid for the Iron Fang riders, and that someone would want their investment back. He saddled the Mustang and rode out before the sun cleared the ridge. The air was sharp with the scent of wet sage, the ground soft under the horses' hooves. He kept to the back trails, avoiding the main road to Drywater Junction. If word of Black Hollow had traveled ahead of him, and it always did, there'd be eyes waiting. By midday, the land opened into a wide basin dotted with mesquite and low scrub. In the distance, a plume of dust marked another rider's approach. Silas slowed, hand resting on the Winchester. The rider waved, a broad, easy gesture, and as he drew closer, Silas recognized him. Jonas Creed. Once, they'd ridden together as scouts for the Territorial Survey. Creed had a grin that could talk a rattlesnake out of striking, and a knack for surviving trouble he usually started himself. But there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of calculation, behind the warmth. "Silas Veylan," Creed said, reining in beside him. "Heard you've been making noise. Folks say you dropped Thorn in the mud." "Folks say a lot of things," Silas replied. Creed's grin widened. "True enough. But I'm not here for gossip. I'm here with an offer." They rode side by side toward a stand of cottonwoods, the shade a welcome relief from the sun. Creed talked as they went, about a safe route east, about contacts who could get the map into the hands of the railroad's board before anyone else could touch it. It all sounded too easy. When they stopped to water the horses, Silas caught the faintest glint of metal under Creed's coat, the hilt of a knife, positioned for a quick draw. His gut tightened. "You've got a buyer lined up, don't you?" Silas said quietly. Creed didn't answer right away. He just looked at him, the grin fading. "You've been carrying that thing too long, Silas. It's a burden. Let me take it off your hands." Silas stepped back, hand on his rifle. "Not happening." The air between them went still. Then Creed moved, fast, the knife flashing in the dappled light. Silas twisted aside, the blade grazing his coat, and brought the rifle up hard, the stock cracking against Creed's jaw. The man staggered, dropped the knife, and fell to one knee. "You should have stayed a friend," Silas said. He left Creed there in the shade, the knife buried in the dirt beside him. The Mustang's hooves kicked up dust as Silas rode on, the basin stretching out ahead. The map was still his, but the circle was tightening. Thorne's men had been blunt force. Creed was the knife behind the smile. Whoever came next would be sharper still, and Silas Veylan was running out of friends. The desert night had a way of swallowing sound. Even the Mustang's hoof beats seemed to vanish into the black, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Silas Veylan rode with his coat collar turned up against the chill, the map still strapped to his back like a second spine. The moon was a thin silver blade, cutting the darkness just enough to reveal the jagged silhouettes of the ghost town ahead. Drywater Crossing. Once, it had been a thriving way station for miners and cattlemen. Now, it was nothing but hollow buildings and wind-worn signs. The streets littered with tumbleweeds and broken glass, the kind of place where echoes felt like they belonged to someone else's footsteps. Silas dismounted at the edge of town, tying the Mustang to a leaning hitching post. The horse's ears flicked nervously, nostrils flaring at scents only it could detect. Silas's own senses were stretched thin. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind through the eaves felt like a warning. He moved down the main street, boots crunching on grit. The saloon's swinging doors hung crooked, one hinge broken. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old whiskey. Moonlight spilled through a hole in the roof, painting the warped floorboards in silver. That's when he heard it, the faint metallic click of a hammer being drawn back. Silas froze. The sound had come from the balcony above. Slowly, he shifted his weight, eyes scanning the shadows. A figure stepped into the moonlight, tall, lean, wearing a black hat pulled low. The glint of a rifle barrel caught the light. "Evening, Veylan," the man said, voice low and steady. "You've been a hard one to catch." Silas recognized him instantly. Not a rider. Worse, Elias Marin, a bounty hunter with a reputation for never missing his mark. And if Marin was here, it meant someone had put a price on Silas's head big enough to make even the most dangerous men take notice. "Who's paying you?" Silas asked, his voice calm despite the tension coiling in his gut. Marin smiled faintly. "Doesn't matter. You hand over that map, I walk away. You keep it." "Well, you won't be keeping much else." Before Silas could answer, a sound cut through the night. The distant thunder of hooves. Marin's eyes flicked toward the street, and in that heartbeat of distraction, Silas dove behind the bar. A bullet splintered the wood where his head had been. The riders were here. The saloon erupted into chaos. Marin fired at the newcomers, his shots precise, dropping two before they could dismount. Silas used the confusion to slip out the back, moving through the narrow alley between the saloon and the general store. The moonlight caught on something ahead, the gleam of a rifle barrel. Another rider, waiting. Silas didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the man's arm and slamming him into the wall. The rifle clattered to the ground. Silas drove his fist into the rider's jaw, then snatched up the weapon and kept moving. The ghost town became a maze of shadows and gunfire. Marin was somewhere in the fray, his shots echoing off the buildings. The riders were spreading out, trying to box Silas in. He ducked into the old blacksmith shop, the smell of rust and soot still lingering after all these years. From the doorway, he could see the street, and in the center of it, Garrick Thorne's second in command, a scar-faced brute named Calder Pike. Pike was barking orders, his voice carrying over the gunfire. If Silas could take him out, the riders might break. He steadied the rifle on the windowsill, breath slow, finger tightening on the trigger. The shot rang out, and Pike dropped like a felled tree. The riders hesitated, their formation faltering. That was all Silas needed. He slipped out the back, circling toward the livery where his Mustang waited. Marin appeared from the shadows, rifle in hand, eyes locked on him. For a moment, neither moved. "You're not walking out of here with that map," Marin said. Silas's voice was quiet, but it carried. "Then you'd better be faster than me." The next second was a blur, two shots, almost simultaneous. Marin's hat flew from his head as Silas's bullet grazed his temple. Marin's shot went wide, shattering a lantern. Flames licked up the side of the building, the dry wood catching fast. The fire spread quickly, casting the ghost town in a flickering orange glow. The riders, seeing the blaze, began to retreat. Marin cursed and vanished into the smoke. Silas swung into the saddle, the Mustang surging forward. Behind him, dry water crossing burned, the flames consuming what was left of the town. Ahead, the desert stretched out under the cold light of the moon. The map was still his. But now, there were 2 hunters on his trail, the riders and Elias Marin. And Silas knew that the next time they met, it wouldn't be in the shadows. The desert at dawn was a strange kind of quiet, not peace, but the pause before a blade falls. Silas Veylan rode east, the horizon bleeding from black into pale gold. The Mustang's breath steamed in the cold air, each exhale a ghost that vanished into the morning. The map was still strapped to his back, but it felt less like a burden now and more like a fuse, one spark away from setting the whole territory alight. He'd been running for days, sleeping in dry creek beds, drinking from muddy water holes, always moving. The riders were still out there, their numbers thinned but their resolve sharpened. And somewhere in the shadows, Elias Marin was tracking him too, a lone wolf with a bounty hunter's patience. By mid-morning, Silas reached the rim of a canyon, so deep the sunlight hadn't yet touched its floor. The wind here carried the scent of mesquite and something else, smoke, faint but fresh. He dismounted, crouching low, scanning the far side. That's when he saw them, 3 riders, camped near the ruins of an old telegraph station. Their horses were tethered in the shade, rifles propped against a fallen beam. They weren't expecting company. Silas's mind worked fast. If he could take them out quietly, he might buy himself a day's lead. He slid down the canyon wall, boots finding silent purchase on the rock, and moved through the scrub until he was close enough to hear their voices. The first went down without a sound, a quick strike to the temple with the butt of his rifle. The second reached for his gun, but Silas was faster. The third bolted for his horse, shouting, but a single shot dropped him before he reached the reins. Silas searched the camp. Among the saddlebags, he found something that made his stomach tighten, a folded piece of paper, marked with the same ink and measurements as his own map. Only this one was incomplete, the lines ending abruptly where his began. The riders hadn't just been chasing him. They'd been piecing together the route from multiple sources, which meant someone else had part of the map. He didn't have long to think about it. A shadow fell across the ground, long and unmistakable. Silas turned, rifle raised, and found himself staring at Elias Marin. The bounty hunter stood 10 paces away, revolver in hand, his expression unreadable. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Marin said. Silas's voice was steady. "You're not here for the money anymore." Marin tilted his head. "Maybe not. Maybe I just don't like the idea of one man holding the future of half the territory in his hands." The standoff stretched, the canyon wind whispering between them. Then Marin's gaze flicked past Silas, and his jaw tightened. Silas risked a glance, dust rising on the far ridge. More riders. At least 6. Marin cursed under his breath. "Looks like we're both out of time." For a moment, neither moved. Then, without a word, Marin holstered his revolver and drew his rifle. "We hold them here," he said. "After that, we'll see." Silas nodded once. They took positions behind the telegraph station's crumbling wall, the sound of hoof beats growing louder. The first rider crested the ridge, and the canyon erupted in gunfire. The fight was brutal and close. Bullets tore splinters from the beams, ricocheted off stone, kicked up clouds of dust. Silas dropped 2 riders in quick succession. Marin took another, his shots precise and unhurried. But the enemy kept coming. A bullet grazed Silas's arm, hot pain flaring down to his fingertips. He gritted his teeth, reloaded, and kept firing. Marin shouted something, a warning, but it was drowned out by the roar of a shotgun blast that shattered the wall between them. When the dust cleared, only 3 riders were left. They hesitated, seeing their numbers broken, and then turned tail, vanishing back over the ridge. Silas lowered his rifle, chest heaving. Marin was leaning against the wall, blood seeping from a crease along his ribs. "You're still alive," Silas said. "Don't sound so surprised," Marin replied. a faint smile tugging at his mouth. They stood there for a long moment, the canyon silent again except for the wind. Then Marin straightened, wincing. "This isn't over, Veylan. But for now, you'd better move. Whoever's holding the rest of that map won't wait forever." Silas mounted the Mustang, the incomplete map from the rider's camp tucked into his coat. The circle was tightening, but now he had a new lead, and maybe, just maybe, an uneasy ally. As he rode out of the canyon, the sun finally reached the floor below, turning the rock to gold. It felt like a promise, or a warning. The wind carried the smell of something burned long before Silas saw the smoke. He reined in the Mustang at the crest of a low ridge, scanning the valley below. What had once been a small way station, a cluster of adobe huts and a corral, was now nothing but blackened frames and drifting ash. The fire was recent. The ground still shimmered with heat. Silas dismounted, boots sinking into the scorched earth. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint creak of a half-collapsed beam. He crouched near the remains of the corral gate and found what he'd expected: hoofprints. Dozens of them, deep and erratic, as if the riders had been in a hurry. He followed the tracks to the edge of the settlement, where the ground sloped toward a dry riverbed. There, half buried in the sand, was a strip of red striped cloth, the mark of the Iron Fang riders. But there was something else, too, a brass cartridge casing, engraved with a small, unfamiliar symbol. Not Thorne's men. Someone new had been here. The Mustang's ears flicked, and Silas heard it too. The faint jingle of tack, the whisper of movement in the brush. He slipped behind the charred remains of a wall, rifle ready. A figure emerged from the shadows, hands raised. It was a woman, her clothes travel-stained, a revolver holstered at her hip. Her eyes were sharp, assessing him as much as he was assessing her. "Name's Arden Vale," she said. "You're carrying something that doesn't belong to you." Silas didn't lower the rifle. "You with the riders?" She shook her head. "No, but I know who's paying them. And if you want to keep that map, you're going to need more than a fast horse." Her tone was calm, but there was an urgency beneath it. Silas studied her for a moment, then gestured for her to speak. She told him about a man named Corvin Slate, a railroad magnate with enough money to buy half the territory, and enough ambition to want the other half. Slate had been collecting pieces of the survey map for months, using the riders to do his dirty work. The incomplete map Silas had taken from the canyon camp, one of Slate's. "Why tell me this?" Silas asked. "Because Slate doesn't just want the land," Arden said. "He wants control, and once he's got it, no one rides free." Before Silas could reply, a rifle cracked from the ridge. The bullet punched into the dirt between them. Arden drew her revolver, firing back toward the flash of movement. Silas grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the Mustang. They rode hard for the cover of the riverbed, bullets whining past. Whoever was on that ridge was skilled. The shots came close enough to feel the air shift. When they finally reached the shelter of the canyon wall, Silas dismounted, scanning the heights. The shooter was gone. Arden swung down from her saddle, breathing hard. "That wasn't one of the riders," she said. "That was Slate's man. He's called the Long Shot, and if he's here, it means Slate's close." Silas felt the weight of the map against his back. The circle was tightening again. Riders on one side, Slate's hired guns on the other, and now a stranger who claimed to be an ally. He didn't trust her, but he didn't have the luxury of riding alone anymore. "All right, Vale," he said. "You ride with me. But understand this, the first time you cross me, you won't get a second." Her smile was quick and humorless. "Fair enough." They mounted up and rode into the deepening shadows of the canyon. The sound of the wind in the rocks, like a whisper of things yet to come. Night was closing in fast. The shadows of Canyon Ridge stretched long and jagged, swallowing the narrow pass ahead. Silas Veylan slowed his Mustang to a cautious walk. Beside him, Arden Vale rode in silence, her eyes scanning the ridgelines. The air felt heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. They had been tracking Slate's men all day. The trail had led them to an abandoned freight line, rusted rails, rotting ties, and a narrow choke point where the track cut between two sheer walls of rock. It was the perfect place for an ambush. The Mustang snorted, ears flicking forward. Silas felt the tension in the reins just before he saw it. A faint glint of metal high on the ridge. He didn't need a second look to know it was a rifle barrel. Ridge, he murmured. Arden's hand went to her revolver, but before she could draw, the first shot cracked through the pass. The bullet sparked off the rail inches from Silas's boot. He kicked the Mustang forward, urging it toward a cluster of boulders just ahead. Arden followed, the two of them diving for cover as more shots rang out. The echoes bounced wildly between the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell how many shooters there were. Silas risked a glance, at least for men on the ridge, maybe more hidden in the rocks. And then he saw it, a length of wire stretched low across the track, leading to a crate half buried in gravel. Dynamite, he said under his breath. Slate's men weren't just trying to kill them, they were planning to bring the whole pass down. Arden caught his eye. We can't stay here, Silas nodded. We split. Draw their fire. Make them waste their shots. They moved as one. Silas broke left, firing up at the ridge to keep the shooters' heads down. Arden darted right, her revolver barking in sharp, measured bursts. The gunmen shifted their aim, trying to track both targets at once. A bullet tore through Silas's coat, grazing his ribs. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the sting, and spotted a narrow goat trail winding up the canyon wall. It was steep, but it would put him behind the ridge line. He climbed fast, boots slipping on loose rock, the sound of gunfire and Arden's shouts echoing below. By the time he reached the top, his breath was ragged, but he had the drop on them now. The nearest gunman never saw him coming. Silas swung the butt of his rifle hard, sending the man sprawling. The others turned too late. Two quick shots dropped them, and the last man bolted, disappearing into the dark below. Arden was already cutting the dynamite wire. She looked up as Silas descended, a faint smirk on her face. Took you long enough. He allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Let's move before they regroup. They rode out of Dead Man's Switch under a sky thick with stars, the air still carrying the scent of gunpowder. Silas knew this was just another move in Slate's game, and the next one would be worse. The desert night was cold enough to bite. Silas Veylan and Arden Vale moved like shadows along the dry wash, their horses tethered a mile back to avoid noise. Ahead, the faint orange glow of campfires flickered against the canyon walls, Slate's supply camp. From here, the smell of wood smoke mixed with the tang of boiled coffee and the faint metallic scent of oil. Guns, they crouched behind a cluster of boulders, surveying the camp. 24 men, maybe more, moved between tents and wagons. Crates were stacked high near the center, marked with the railroad's crest, stolen supplies. And in the largest tent, lit from within, a figure leaned over a table. Even from this distance, Silas could see the glint of a map spread across it. That's it, Arden whispered. The other half, Silas's jaw tightened. Then we take it. They waited for the right moment, a change of the guard, a burst of laughter from the far side of camp. Then they slipped from cover, keeping low, moving between shadows. The ground was soft with sand, muffling their steps. Every heartbeat felt like it might give them away. Near the big tent, they paused. Two guards stood at the entrance, rifles slung but eyes alert. Arden's hand brushed Silas's arm, a silent signal. She veered left, tossing a small stone into the darkness. The clatter drew the guards' attention, and they moved to investigate. Silas slipped inside. The tent smelled of tobacco and dust. On the table, the map lay open, his halves twin, the ink lines crisp and precise. But there was something else, notes in the margins, coordinates, and a list of names. One of them made his blood run cold. Elias Marin. Before he could process it, a voice spoke from the shadows. I was wondering when you'd show. Corvin Slate stepped into the lamplight, tall and broad, his suit dusty but expensive. His eyes were sharp, calculating. You've been making quite a mess, Veylan. Killing my men, stealing my property. Silas's hand hovered near his revolver. You've been sending killers after me. Slate smiled thinly. Business, nothing personal. But now you've forced my hand. Outside, a shout rang out, Arden's voice, sharp and urgent. Silas grabbed the map half from the table and bolted for the flap. Gunfire erupted, the night exploding into chaos. Arden was crouched behind a wagon, trading shots with the guards. Silas Doven beside her, the stolen map clutched tight. Got it. She asked. Got it, he said, breathless. They fought their way back toward the wash. Bullets sparking off rocks, shouts echoing through the camp. A lantern shattered, flames licking up the side of a supply wagon. The fire spread fast, throwing the camp into confusion. By the time they reached their horses, the camp was a storm of smoke and shouting. They rode hard into the night, the two halves of the map now in their possession, but with Slate's fury certain to follow. Silas didn't speak until the campfires were just a faint glow behind them. We've got what we came for, he said. Now we find out what it's worth. Arden glanced at him, her expression unreadable. And who's willing to kill for it? The desert swallowed their words, leaving only the sound of hooves and the whisper of wind over stone. The fire crackled low, throwing long shadows across the canyon wall. Silas Veylan sat cross-legged on the ground, both halves of the map spread out before him. The parchment was worn, the ink faded in places, but together the lines formed a route that cut through the heart of the territory, a path no one had dared to chart before. It wasn't just a railroad survey. It was a blueprint for control. Arden Vale crouched opposite him, her eyes scanning the map. This isn't just about laying track, she said quietly. These lines pass through every water source for 100 miles. Whoever owns this, owns the West. Silas didn't answer right away. He traced a finger along the route, stopping at a small, unmarked canyon. Here, he said, this is where Slate will make his move. It's the only choke point big enough to stop a supply train without destroying it. Arden leaned back, studying him. You've been thinking about this for a while. I've been thinking about it since the first time someone tried to kill me for this map. Silas replied. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hoofbeats. Both of them froze. Silas reached for his rifle, Arden for her revolver. The sound grew louder, then faded again, a patrol passing along the ridge above. They waited until the night swallowed the noise before speaking again. Arden's voice was low. You trust me yet? Silas looked at her for a long moment. Trust isn't the word I'd use, but I believe you want Slate stopped. That's enough for now. She gave a small, humorless smile. Fair. They packed the map away, doused the fire, and moved deeper into the canyon. The moonlight painted the rocks in silver and shadow, and every step felt like it was taking them further into enemy territory. Silas knew Slate wouldn't wait long to strike, and that Marin was still out there, somewhere between ally and executioner. By the time they reached the narrow pass that would lead them toward the choke point, the first light of dawn was touching the horizon. Silas paused, looking back at the trail they'd come. It felt like the last stretch of open ground before the walls closed in. From here on, he said, we move like ghosts. Arden nodded. And if we're lucky? Silas adjusted the rifle on his shoulder. We won't need luck. They disappeared into the pass, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the stone. The canyon stretched ahead like the throat of some ancient beast, narrow, winding, and treacherous. Silas Veylan reined in the Mustang at the crest of a ridge, scanning the land below. The morning sun had just cleared the horizon, spilling gold over the jagged rock faces. Down in the pass, the shadows still clung to the stone, deep and cold. This was the place marked on the map, the choke point, the only place where a supply train could be stopped without destroying it. Arden Vale rode up beside him, her breath visible in the crisp air. Looks like a coffin waiting for a lid, she murmured. Silas didn't answer. His eyes traced the ridgelines, noting every outcrop, every boulder that could hide a rifleman. He'd fought enough ambushes to know that the land itself could be a weapon. They dismounted and led the horses down a narrow goat trail to the canyon floor. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer. The walls rose high on either side, streaked with veins of quartz and iron. Somewhere above, a hawk cried, a sharp, lonely sound that echoed off the stone dot at a bend in the pass. They found the remains of an old mining shack, half collapsed but still standing enough to offer shelter. Inside, dust motes swirled in the slanted light. A rusted stove sat in one corner, and a broken cot leaned against the wall. Silas set down his pack and unrolled the map on the cot's frame. Here, he said, pointing to a narrow section of the pass. If we block this with rockfall, we can force them to stop. That's when we hit them. Arden studied the map, then the canyon outside. We'll need charges, And a way to set them without being seen. Silas nodded. There's blasting powder in the old telegraph station we passed 2 days ago. We'll have to go back for it. They spent the rest of the day scouting the ridges, marking positions where a shooter could cover the pass. Silas moved with the quiet focus of a man who'd done this before, measuring distances, checking sight lines, noting where the sun would be at different hours. Arden followed his lead, her eyes sharp, her questions precise. By late afternoon, they returned to the shack. Silas built a small fire in the stove, the smell of burning mesquite filling the air. They ate in silence for a while, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Finally, Arden spoke. You ever think about what happens after this? Silas looked up from the map. After? Yeah, say we stop Slate. Say we keep the map out of his hands. Then what? You go back to surveying. I go back to whatever it is I was doing before. Silas's gaze drifted to the fire. I don't think there's a before anymore. Not after this. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the cracks in the shack's walls. Somewhere in the distance, a rock tumbled down the canyon wall. Silas's hand went to his rifle. They stepped outside, scanning the ridges. The sun was low now, the light turning the canyon walls to blood red. For a moment, everything was still. Then Silas saw it, a flicker of movement high on the ridge to the east. A rider, silhouetted against the sky, watching them. Arden's voice was barely a whisper. They've found us. The figure turned and disappeared over the ridge. Silas knew what that meant. Slate's men would be here soon, maybe by nightfall, maybe by dawn. Either way, the clock had started ticking. He turned to Arden. We get the powder tonight. We set the charges before they arrive. And when they come through this pass. He glanced at the narrow canyon, the high walls, the killing ground they'd just mapped out. We make sure they don't leave. Arden's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. Then let's get to work. They saddled the horses as the last light bled from the sky, riding out into the deepening dark. Behind them, the canyon waited, silent, patient, and ready to decide who would live to see the sun rise. The moon was a pale coin half hidden behind drifting clouds, casting the desert in shifting shades of silver and black. Silas Veylan and Arden Vale rode hard, the Mustang's hooves muffled by the sandy wash. The old telegraph station lay 5 miles east, a crumbling relic from a time when messages traveled faster than bullets. Now, it was just another forgotten place. Except for the crates of blasting powder Silas knew were still inside, they kept to the low ground, weaving between dry arroyos and stands of mesquite. The night air was cold enough to sting their lungs, but neither spoke. Every sound, the creak of saddle leather, the distant yip of a coyote, felt amplified in the stillness. By the time they reached the station, the clouds had thickened, blotting out the moon. The building loomed out of the dark, its roof sagging, windows gaping like empty eyes. Silas dismounted first, rifle in hand, and moved to the door. The hinges groaned as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint tang of old explosives. Wooden crates were stacked against the far wall, stenciled with faded letters, black powder, handle with care. Arden slipped in behind him, her revolver drawn. Looks like no one's been here in years, she whispered. Silas shook his head. No one who wanted to live long. They worked quickly, prying open the crates and transferring the powder into smaller canvas sacks they could carry on horseback. Every movement was deliberate. One wrong jolt could turn the station into a fireball. They had just finished loading the last sack when Silas froze. Outside, faint but distinct, came the sound of hooves. More than one horse, moving slow, deliberate. Arden's eyes met his. We've got company. They doused their lantern and slipped out the back, leading the horses into the shadow of a collapsed shed. From there, they could see them, 3 riders, dark shapes against the lighter sand, moving toward the station. One carried a lantern, its glow bobbing with each step. Silas's mind raced. If the riders found the powder gone, they'd know someone had been here. And if they spotted the tracks leading away. He gestured to Arden, and they mounted up, keeping low in the saddle. They moved out in silence, following the edge of the arroyo, letting the terrain hide them. For a moment, it seemed they might slip away unnoticed. Then a shout split the night. The riders had seen them. Silas kicked the Mustang into a gallop. the sacks of powder thumping against the saddle. Behind them, the pounding of hooves grew louder. A rifle cracked, the shot whining past his ear. Arden fired back over her shoulder, the muzzle flash lighting her face in brief, fierce bursts. The chase tore across the desert, weaving between boulders and dry washes. Silas knew they couldn't outrun them forever, not with the extra weight. They needed to lose them in the terrain. Up ahead, the land dropped into a narrow ravine. Silas veered toward it, the Mustang leaping down the slope in a spray of gravel. Arden followed, the riders close behind. The walls of the ravine rose high, the moonlight barely touching the floor. Silas spotted a split in the rock, a narrow side passage barely wide enough for a horse. He turned into it without slowing, the Mustang's flanks brushing stone. Arden was right behind him. The passage twisted sharply, then opened into a hidden basin surrounded by cliffs. They pulled up, breathing hard. The hoof beats of their pursuers thundered past the entrance, fading into the distance. Silas waited, counting the seconds, until the night was silent again. Arden let out a slow breath. That was close. Silas nodded, scanning the shadows. Too close. They'll be back on our trail by morning. They didn't linger. By the time the first light touched the horizon, they were back at the choke point. The sacks of powder stacked inside the old mining shack. The canyon was still and silent, but Silas could feel the tension in the air, like the land itself knew what was coming. The canyon was still in the pale light before dawn. The air so cold it felt like it might shatter if you spoke too loud. Silas Veylan stood on the ridge above the choke point, scanning the horizon. The sacks of blasting powder they'd risked their lives to retrieve were stacked neatly beside him, each one a promise of violence waiting to be unleashed. Arden Vale was below, moving with quiet precision among the rocks. She'd already set to charges along the narrowest part of the pass, tucking them into crevices where they'd be invisible from the trail. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable, but Silas could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. They worked without speaking for the first hour. The only sounds were the scrape of boots on stone, the faint clink of tools, and the whisper of wind through the canyon. Every so often, Silas would pause, listening, not just for hoof beats, but for the subtle shift in the air that meant someone was out there, watching. By mid-morning, the sun had crept high enough to paint the canyon walls in gold and rust. The charges were in place, the fuses coiled and hidden. Silas tested each one twice, then covered the powder sacks with a tarp and loose rock. If Slate's men came early, they'd have no idea what was waiting for them. They retreated to the old mining shack, now their command post. Inside, the map lay open on the cot, weighted down with a canteen. Silas traced the route again, his finger stopping at the choke point. When they hit here, they'll have no room to maneuver. We take out the lead riders, drop the rockfall, and the rest will be trapped. Arden leaned against the wall, arms crossed. And if they bring more men than we expect? Silas met her gaze. Then we make them pay for every yard. The day stretched on, slow and heavy. They took turns on watch, scanning the ridges for movement. The waiting was the hardest part. Every minute gave the enemy more time to plan, more time to close in. Silas could feel the pressure building, like the air before a thunderstorm. Late in the afternoon, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Far to the west, a dust plume rose against the horizon. He watched it for a long moment, then lowered the spyglass. "They're coming," he said. Arden joined him at the ridge. The plume was faint but growing, the sunlight catching on flashes of metal. Riders, dozens of them. They went over the plan one last time, voices low, movements deliberate. When the sun dipped behind the canyon wall, they lit a small fire in the shack's stove, not for warmth, but for the comfort of routine. Outside, the shadows deepened, and the sound of distant hoof beats began to echo through the stone. Silas checked his rifle, then the revolver at his hip. Arden did the same. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. The canyon was ready. The powder was set, and the enemy was almost here. The first rider appeared at dawn, a lone scout, his silhouette black against the pale sky, pausing on the ridge to scan the canyon below. Silas Veylan lay prone behind a boulder, the cold stone biting into his cheek, watching through the rifle sights. He didn't fire, not yet. The scout turned and signaled, and moments later the horizon boiled with dust. They came in waves, Slate's riders, dark shapes in the morning haze, the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels. The sound of their approach filled the canyon, a low, rolling thunder that made the ground tremble. Arden Vale crouched beside the detonator, her eyes fixed on the narrowest part of the pass where the charges lay hidden. Silas's voice was low, steady. "Wait for the lead riders to pass the marker." The first dozen thundered into the choke point, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the stone. Slate himself rode near the front, tall in the saddle, his coat snapping in the wind. Behind him, more men poured in, the canyon swallowing them whole. "Now," Silas said. Arden slammed the plunger. The explosion tore through the morning, a deafening roar that sent a wall of rock crashing down across the pass. Horses screamed, men shouted, the air filled with dust and the acrid stench of powder. The lead riders were thrown into chaos, some crushed under falling stone, others scrambling for cover. Silas opened fire from his position on the ridge. Every shot found its mark. Arden joined in, her revolver barking in sharp, measured bursts. The trapped riders tried to return fire, but the canyon walls turned their bullets into ricochets. The narrow ground that had been their path forward was now their prison. Slate's voice cut through the chaos, bellowing orders. He dismounted, using a fallen boulder for cover, and began rallying his men. Even pinned, he was dangerous, his rifle cracked, and a bullet chipped the rock inches from Silas's head. The fight raged for what felt like hours, but could only have been minutes. The canyon floor was a churn of dust, blood, and shattered stone. One by one, the riders fell or fled, until only Slate remained, crouched behind cover. His breath ragged, Silas descended from the ridge, rifle in hand. Arden flanked him, her revolver steady. Slate rose slowly, eyes cold, a faint smile on his lips. "You think killing me changes anything?" he said. "There'll be others." "There are always others." "Maybe," Silas said. "But they won't have this." He held up the map, both halves now joined. Slate's hand twitched toward his gun. Silas didn't give him the chance. One shot echoed through the canyon, and Slate crumpled to the dust. Silence fell, broken only by the wind sighing through the rocks. Arden holstered her revolver, her gaze on the fallen man. "It's over," she said. Silas looked down the length of the canyon, the morning sun burning away the last of the dust. For now, they buried the powder under loose stone, erased their tracks, and rode out of the choke point. Behind them, the canyon lay quiet, the echoes of battle fading into memory. Ahead, the open land stretched to the horizon, uncertain, dangerous, but free. Silas didn't know where the trail would take them next, but for the first time in weeks, the weight on his back was gone. The map was safe, the riders were broken, and the West, for the moment, belonged to those who could hold it.